Hey guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet, and this week's video is brought to you by Audible. And I should probably explain that I'm in a little bit of a different setup because we're actually working on a few projects here at the TFD office, which is where I work most days as opposed to my home office, which you normally see me in on this channel. As you can see, it's a more pink and girly and effeminate space, but I still like it a lot. You know what? I was just corrected off camera that I don't need to defend pink, and I won't. I love pink. It's a great color. I love being surrounded by it. But anyway, today here in the comfort of my office, I thought I would share with you guys some of the best financial advice I've ever received. Some of these are more literal and some of them are more kind of spiritual, but the point is that for me, they have provided guiding lights in handling my money and making the right decisions, both before and after I started TFD. So let's get right into it with the 5 best pieces of financial advice I've ever received. Number 1. Feeling rich is the difference between what you can spend and what you do spend. Now, obviously, there are going to be some literal factors that go into how wealthy one can feel at any given time. If you are struggling to make ends meet every month and each new bill is totally an uncertainty, of course you're not going to feel particularly rich. But the feeling of being rich is often something that even people with a lot of money don't have access to. You might occasionally see on social media like a budget breakdown of a very rich person or couple that's getting absolutely ripped to shreds because they earn hundreds of thousands of dollars yet constantly feel like they're broke because they're spending all the way up to the top of their ability. I was actually recently talking to someone who is in just that situation, which living here in New York City is much more common than you might imagine. You can be taking in $500,000 a year, but if you're spending $499,999 of those dollars every year, you are going to constantly feel broke. And more importantly, every element of your lifestyle is predicated on your ability to continue earning exactly that amount or more, which is not always a guarantee. But alternatively, you can be someone who earns a lot less than that and still feel like you're in a great, rich place because there's a huge barrier between what you are spending and what you could be spending. That means that you're not constantly living in a precarious state. It means that you are able to respond if things change. And it means that you're always leaving yourself options. So much of what can keep people on the hamster wheel of things like credit card debt or loans or even just general overspending is what we call lifestyle inflation, where basically what used to be enough for you is no longer enough when you have access to more. Like, let's say when you were 20 years old, you could afford to take one vacation a year and it was the most budget possible vacation where you were like carpooling with friends and you all had to like split a hotel room between 5 of you and you couldn't go out to dinner. And then a few years later, or maybe 10 years later, you can go on multiple vacations a year and you don't always have to take the absolute cheapest option of everything. So you start to get acquired to slightly better tastes with these things. What used to be extravagant to you is now normal to you. So what used to seem so wonderful can sometimes seem like not enough. So going out of your way to combat that lifestyle inflation so you can stay at that lower price point is so important. Something I like to practice in my life is being really aggressive about gratitude. I'll go out of my way to say how much I enjoy something, to acknowledge little pleasures that people can tend to ignore, to even just take a time when I'm traveling for work and I'm in kind of like an anonymous hotel and it may not seem very cool to someone who travels a lot for work. I walk around, I'm like, wow, I get to travel for work, I'm on a plane, I got a free glass of champagne maybe, like there's like fresh towels, there's a robe, it's so exciting. And honestly, a huge part of what has allowed me to keep that lifestyle inflation down and to keep my margin between what I can spend and what I do spend as wide as possible is really practicing that gratitude and not letting myself go totally crazy. Once you have the basics covered, it doesn't matter how much you earn, it matters how much you spend compared to how much you earn. That's the key to feeling rich. Number 2, it's not in my budget is a complete sentence. I used to be very insecure about my money situation, especially during like my adolescence and early 20s when I really didn't have a lot of money. I was often around people who had a lot more than I did, and I felt really embarrassed about not being able to keep up with them, which inevitably led me to do things I couldn't afford to do, which was often obviously going on credit cards, and just generally not saving anything because I was always trying to pretend like I had more than I did. I felt like people would judge me if I said that something wasn't in my my budget, or I felt like it would make me seem like a loser, or maybe even that it meant that the person in question wasn't important, which isn't true because, for example, if someone was having a really expensive birthday party, just because I couldn't afford to go to it doesn't mean I didn't love that person. It just means that I couldn't afford to go to that really expensive dinner. But as the years have gone by, I've learned more and more that being totally upfront about what is and isn't in your budget and not making any apologies for it is one of the biggest steps to getting total control over your spending. So much of our worst spending decisions are driven by social pressure or the need to fit in or to please other people. But ultimately, every spending choice that we make, including and possibly especially social spending, should be things that we actively want to do and can comfortably afford to do. So the longer you spend feeling embarrassed or ashamed about saying that something isn't your budget, or even possibly making up alternative excuses so you don't have to tell people it's not in your budget, the longer you're going to be spending a crazy amount of money on stuff that you can't afford to be doing. And most importantly, if anyone makes you feel guilty or ashamed about being clear if something's not in your budget, that's their problem, not yours. Number 3, money does not always go to the people who deserve it the most or to the people who work hardest for it. In America, we grow up with a very pervasive myth that money will always naturally go to the people who are working hardest. We love to lionize entrepreneurs and CEOs and learn every detail of their daily routine and think of all the ways that we can be more like them to get closer to their lifestyle, their income, and their success. But here's what most really wealthy people in America have in common. They come from wealth. It is much less relevant to you to know that a CEO of a major corporation gets up at 4 a.m, and more relevant to know that his family goes back like 5 generations at his Ivy League school and that he was born with a trust fund of at least $100,000. There will always be exceptions, but statistically speaking, the most wealthy amongst us grew up wealthy. And so the idea that people acquire wealth because they're working hardest for it or they most deserve it is just untrue. Because look at the other side of it, working hard. Millions of Americans work multiple jobs, even multiple full-time jobs, just to barely get by in this country. And how do we even define working hard? Because if you think about it, most of the wealthiest people in this country have enormous access to things like domestic help or convenience or control over their time. They can outsource almost everything, whereas the average person I mentioned who might be working 2 full-time jobs to scrape by, if they have children, they're also doing all of that themselves. If they have elderly parents to care for, same thing there. Or even just doing all of their own basic domestic tasks is a huge part of their day-to-day. I don't buy the idea that an executive who makes thousands of times more than an average worker at their company is working literally thousands of times harder. And perhaps you could argue that in some ways these people are working smarter, but that would be discounting all of the enormous advantages that lead people to get to these elite social and professional positions in the first place. It is very, very rare that a person is able to work their way up from cleaning the building to owning the building. And yes, sometimes it does happen and people make something out of nothing. And we celebrate those stories over and over again. But statistically, they are very uncommon. And the vast majority of the super wealthy in this country, as I mentioned, came from wealth. So all of that is to say, the more you can internalize this idea that the money that you have or don't have is not overly tied to how much you deserve it or how much you work, and that there's no need to idolize the super wealthy as like inhuman gods of productivity and drive and deserving, the happier and saner you'll be with the life that you have. And the more you'll feel clarity in advocating for more egalitarian systems in which there aren't such insane discrepancies in what people have. Number 4, the worst thing you can do is not know. When I had ruined credit, a negative account balance, no savings, all those horrible, scary things, one of my worst habits is that I would totally avoid looking. I wouldn't look at my credit score, I wouldn't look at my bank statements, I wouldn't even count the cash that I had in a shoebox in my room because I just didn't want to know. And a huge part of that is because I knew what was waiting for me was going to be bad. And it was so much easier to live a relatively happy life if I could just go on pretending as though none of that was happening and living just with the cash that was in my wallet and figuring it out as I went. But in fixing those problems I mentioned one by one, a universal truth was that I had to become intimately familiar with those details. I had to know my credit score by heart and what got me there and the steps I could take to make it better. I had to vigorously check my account balance to make sure everything was accounted for and that I wasn't wasting my own money. I had to check up regularly on my net worth to make sure that I wasn't just coasting by on a little bit of savings while spending too much that was really eating into the bottom line of what I needed to be saving toward in terms of long-term goals. And the more I confronted the realities of these things on a daily basis, even when the numbers weren't so good, the easier it became to keep doing so. Ultimately, our biggest fears can lie in ignorance. When we don't know, we can build monsters out of these situations, especially financially. But once you get to the point where you're checking these things every day or at least every week, you start to realize they're not that scary and you can understand them. And even if you can't change them overnight, you can start to take active steps to have more control over them. They become a manageable part of your life instead of this vague, scary thing lurking in the background of it. So if the worst thing you can do is not know, the best thing you can do is know no matter what the truth is. Lastly, number 5 is that learning the difference between need and really want is the key to a healthy budget. Ultimately, we can convince ourselves to spend on almost anything if we can justify categorizing it as a need. And that can be anything from the apartment you live in to the car you drive to the various details of all of your day-to-day purchases. It's really up to us to say at the end of the day what we really categorize as a need. No one else can tell us what that is outside of a few very, very basic things. You have to get to work, but the degree of luxury in which you get there is kind of up to you. And with that lifestyle inflation that I mentioned earlier, as you continue to have nicer things, you start to feel like those nicer versions of things are simply what you need rather than just something you really want or really like. And yes, there are always going to be purchases that aren't totally justifiable as a need, but it's up to you to recognize those for what they are and categorize them and budget for them accordingly. And stop categorizing things as needs, which are just your tastes getting more luxurious or you getting used to more conveniences. There are many times when I really want to take a car, but I don't need to. I can easily take the train, but I could easily justify it in my head and say, oh, well, that time that I can save, I could use on other things. But no, the answer is that I know I'll probably just get home slightly earlier and sit on the couch and watch TV for 15 minutes or something. That is not going to make or break my life nor my budget. But the more I can categorize it as not something that I need, the more I can recognize it for what it is and judge accordingly. No matter what your budget looks like, making sure to take out all of the various items that you have gotten used to spending on and really decide how much of them are necessities and how much of them you could probably live without is something you have to regularly do. Otherwise, that lifestyle inflation will frequently creep up on us, and that first point about feeling rich being the difference between what you can spend and what you do spend will be totally out of reach. And if you're looking for a budget-friendly way to enhance your everyday activities, I highly recommend Audible. Audible is actually an integral part of my daily commute, my walks around the neighborhood, when I cook dinner at home, and all of that good stuff where I can't be reading, but sometimes I would like to be. I actually recently listened to Roxane Gay's Hunger, which I highly recommend in part because she has an extremely pleasing voice to listen to while she reads the book. But no matter what your literary interest is, Audible has plenty of books for you, which you no longer have to worry about being able to read on the actual page in order to enjoy. So go to audible.com/thefinancialdiet or text The Financial Diet to 500-500 and start listening with an exclusive 30-day trial, 1 free audiobook of your choice, and 2 Audible originals from an ever-changing list. As always, guys, thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday for new and awesome videos. Bye!